Welcome back with a smiling face. Important note before starting, if you are a fan of audio stories, then our Patreon account is the best platform for you. Join us on Patreon for the best audiobooks ever. Luna's Resurgence. Episode 14. Chapter 82 to 87. Lucinda POV. A real date. He'd actually asked her out on a real date. It was a bit exciting. Kyra was happy about it, about them getting along finally. She looked at her wardrobe. Nick wanted her to wear that purple dress. She had bought it only to please Lindy and Gabby. They had all been out shopping and the two of them had nagged her into trying it on. Then they had insisted that she buy it, regardless of the fact she told them she had nowhere to wear it, or wasn't likely to ever wear it. Had till this day never worn it. Ever. She had no reason to get all dressed up, did not attend mating balls, and did not go out on dates. She had certainly not wanted unmated wolves trying to paw at her, and once Kyra had come along, neither had she always threatened to rip their heads off, or a limb of some sort. She stood and looked at it, bit her lip. Nick obviously wanted to see her in it. Probably thought about it already, otherwise why ask? That grin on his face, he'd definitely thought about it. She took it down and laid it out on the bed. Okay, she told herself. She was trying now to get along with him, and finding she did like him. Enjoyed teasing and tormenting him. No wonder Lindy did it all the time with Corey. Got out her white lace-up sandals that he'd already seen her wear. Had been wearing the day she'd been made to come to Alpha Corey's office. He'd looked her over, she'd seen it, saw the way he had looked at her lace-up sandals. Liked it. Most men did, it seemed. Back in the bathroom, she curled the bottom half of her hair and left it out to hang loose, applied light makeup and eyeliner, curled her long lashes, no need of mascara, too long already, put on soft pink lipstick and then went and slipped into the dress he wanted her to wear, laced up her shoes and checked her appearance in the mirror. Took in a long, deep, steadying breath. Not once had he come in here to the bedroom to see what she was up to or when she would be ready. Just did as he said he would, sat out there in the living area and waited on her. Stepping out of the bedroom, she found him sitting on the lounge, leaned back all relaxed looking at his phone. He looked up at her and put his phone away. His deep blue eyes moved over her slowly, taking in her appearance, the dress he'd asked her to wear. A smile touched his face. You look beautiful. His voice was soft and husky, already. Lucinda actually felt her cheeks heat as she blushed under his admiring look. Her mate was staring at her, and finding her attractive. Heard him chuckle softly when she looked away a little shyly from his comment and lust-filled eyes. Embarrassed by his open ogling of her. Not that he didn't look at her like that all the time. This was just the first time she had dressed up just for him, like he wanted her to. He stood and she looked him over, surprised to see him wearing a suit, the blue one he had in his closet that never looked worn, the only suit that was not black or grey that he owned. It fit him well, must have been tailor-made for him, though with his size it was likely all his clothes were. He was not going to be able to just walk into a store and pull something off a rack, with his height and build. It was almost the same deep shade of blue as his eyes, she realized. He was not wearing a tie, just a crisp white shirt with the top two buttons undone. His jacket was open and she could see through the fit of his shirt, his muscled abs defined behind it. A neat fit indeed. He stood watching her as she looked him over, and when her eyes finally met his, smiled at her. Acceptable. He teased her. Yes, she covered her mouth, and tried not to laugh, as she recalled the first time she had looked him over, and stated that he was not bad, trying to annoy him on purpose that day. Very, she added. a bit better than the not bad I got last time, he replied to her, so he had been recalling as she was her torments that day. But he didn't seem or sound annoyed with her, he was still smiling. He had done his hair and shaved, was more than acceptable. She thought, Kyra agreed with her. Made him, she piped up. Kyra. Lucinda chastised her wolf and heard her chortle inside her mind. Nick walked over and opened the suite door for her. She was led down to the Alpha's private dining room. It was set for two, a candlelight dinner it seemed. She turned and looked at him questioningly. What? You think I can't be romantic? He chided. I never said that, but it had never really crossed her mind at all. She knew that most mated pairs were loving and affectionate, would often celebrate their mate bond anniversaries with big romantic gestures and lavish gift-giving. Just had never really thought she would get to have that herself. Nick pulled out a chair for her, she sat and felt his mouth touch the side of her neck in a soft kiss. Sent bolts of electricity all over her body, had to bite down on the moan that nearly escaped her. Man was going to seduce her. He sat down, smiling at her knowingly. He knew what that kiss had done to her, his alpha senses had picked it up. She took a steadying breath and tried to calm her heartbeat, but it was not helping that Kyra was again telling her to mate him again. Dinner arrived minutes after they did, and for the first time she and he sat together and held an actual conversation about the things they liked to do. Learned about each other. Lucinda felt comfortable talking with him, and not once did he try to touch her. Lucinda found that Nick's tastes ran more to the savory side, than the sweet. He liked to hang out with his boys and relax with a scotch at the end of the day, didn't mind reading a good sci-fi book, that he would watch just about any movie genre, but liked a good thriller. She told him that she wasn't particularly fussed about thrillers or horror movies at all, more into the sci-fi or space movie, like a good action movie as long as there was a lot of kicking involved. That she likes to listen to classical music, her current favorite two cellos and Vanessa May a violinist. Nick didn't really listen to music, didn't really have time for it, usually always busy with his alpha duties. Not much of a surprise there. Nick asked her, during the dessert, a raspberry cheesecake, if she wanted to watch a movie in the Packhouse theater room or go back to their suite to watch something. She was not fussed either way, the TV in his room was a massive wall TV. He raised an eyebrow. We could skip the movie. He smiled at her. Nick, she shook her head. What about the date? She teased him, but really did mean it. Theater room it is, he smiled back. There was no one in the theater, just her and him. Lucinda looked at him questioningly. Had he cleared it out on purpose so they could have it for themselves? I didn't do this, he smiled. It's midweek, most movies run on the weekends. So what are we going to watch then? She asked. Nick guided her to a chair, one for couples. She noted a double chair with no armrest in between them, and asked her to wait there. He was only gone a few minutes and came back as the lights were dimming and the screen lit up. He sank now next to her, slipped an arm around her and pulled her gently into him. The screen lit up the word Prey. It was the new Predator movie. She turned and looked up at him, smiled right at him. Thought you might like this one, he told her and then kissed her temple when she turned back to focus on the screen. Relaxed and leaned into him to watch it. Nick, she found, was nothing but a gentleman, the whole time. He did not attempt to seduce her while the movie was running, sat relaxed with her tucked into the crook of his arm, his hand resting on her hip the whole time, but other than that he kept it completely PG, surprising her completely. He was normally all out to seduce her when they were alone. The movie ended and he stood casually, took her hand. Let's go to bed, he murmured softly and walked her out of the theater. He didn't appear to be in any rush, a slow casual walk to the elevator. Lucinda could feel her nervousness creeping up on her, bit her lip nervously the whole way through the pack house and while they waited for the elevator. He chuckled softly. "We don't have to, you know." "I know," she murmured back, but couldn't look up at him. They stepped into the elevator, and she was more than nervous now, found herself twisting her hands together. Feeling a little awkward. "Nick." "It's fine," he replied. "It's just that, well, She closed her eyes and chewed on her lower lip, didn't quite know exactly what to say to him. "Not been with anyone since Matthew," he commented softly. Seemingly knowing what she was thinking. Her eyes moved to his. "Is it that obvious?" "No," he smiled down at her, just hazarded a guess. "It's fine, like I said, we don't have to." "I'll wait," she nodded, though still found herself biting her lip. Did she want to wait any more? They walked to the suite and he let her in. "Why don't you go and change?" he told her. Didn't sound like he was annoyed or upset at all. About her hesitation. She turned and looked at him. He was watching her. She bit her lip again, shook her head. "I want to, Nick, just, can we take it slow though?" "Of course," he nodded. Slipped his hand into hers and led her to the bedroom, stopped right at the side of the bed, tilted her chin up to make her look at him. "We can wait." Lucinda shook her head slightly. "I don't want to," and she didn't. Had wanted him on more than one occasion today and knew it. Sat herself down on the bed to undo her shoes. Goddess, she'd never felt so nervous, not even seen him completely naked yet. Bit her lip as she looked up at him. He smiled gently at her as he slipped his jacket off, then leaned down and kissed her gently on the mouth. It was so nice, she liked kissing him, kissed him back. Slid her hands up and around his neck, her eyes fluttered closed, felt his hand slip up and into her hair, tugged her head back to allow him to deepen the kiss. Felt his arm slide around her waist and then she was picked up and moved into the middle of the bed. His mouth never left hers, laid her down and lie right next to her, his hand cupped her face as he kissed her long and slow. She rolled over into him, pressed herself against him. Touched his face gently, tracing her fingers down his neck, right over his mark spot. Heard him growl instantly, "Might not want to do that." He sounded breathless to her. Lucinda giggled softly. "Sorry, do you like that?" She knew he would, his mark spot would be sensitive to her touch. Very sensitive it sounded like. Felt like it, she realized a moment later as his hand suddenly gripped her hip and pulled her against him. He was fully aroused. "Oh," she whispered. He replied, his hips moving against her. Lucinda sighed softly and felt his mouth move to her neck, slide down in a trail of hot kisses that were curling her toes and sending electric shocks all over her skin. His mouth slid right over her mark spot and a moan of pleasure escaped her. Her whole body moved against his, trying to get closer to him. Found herself underneath him, his mouth firmly on her mark spot, kissing hungrily. Another moan left her deeper and more desire-filled than before. Oh goddess, it was amazing to feel. So much pleasure from just one kiss on her skin. He growled against her neck, his body started grinding against hers and she moved back against him. Goddess, it felt so good. Then a hiss of pain ripped out of him and his head snapped back and away from her. His eyes were wide and his breathing heavy and fast. Lucinda stared up at him as his whole body stilled on top of hers, uncertain as to what had just happened. "My oath," he muttered, closed his eyes and took in a long steadying breath, trying to calm himself, she thought. "Are you all right?" She bit her lip. "Yes," he nodded and looked down at her. "Better keep away from your neck is all." "Are you sure?" she asked, a little worried. He'd lost control once already. Will he do it again? "Yes." I'm under control. He touched her face softly. I can put my mouth elsewhere. He smiled at her. She understood his meaning. Smiled a little shyly back. Nick leaned down and kissed her again, shifted himself, his body off of hers and pulled her back onto her side. Nick, she whispered. Slowing it down, he answered her. He slid his hand up her back and then down. She felt her dress's zipper go with his hand and then he was touching her bare back. Electricity flowed across her skin where he stroked her back and then pressed her against him. Lucinda moved against him sighing softly, wanted to be closer to him, to touch him like he was touching her. Tugged at his shirt to loosen it from his pants so she could pull it up. Nick leaned back and away from her, pulled the whole shirt off and moved right back to her, pulling her back up against his chest, his hand sliding over her back again. She slid a hand over his abs, goddess. They were firm and nice under her fingers, slid her hand all the way down to his pants, heard him growl softly again, could hear his breathing quicken, slid one finger up along his V-line, light as feather, his hand was in her hair, pulling her head back, his mouth on hers hungrily and hot, her hand curled around his waist and moved up to slide over his pec. Goddess, it was as hard as the rest of him. Traced her fingers around his knee. His hand slipped down her body hard and fast, pulled her on top of him, both his hands grabbing her and pulling her hard against him. She gasped, as she felt the full size of him grinding hard up against her. Goddess, Nick, she kissed him eagerly, wantonly. How he could make her feel so full of desire so quickly. His head pulled her harder against him, rocking her against him faster. She gasped as pleasure started to build inside her. Oh goddess, she was hot all over, wet and aching for his touch, gasped against his ear. His hands were pulling at her dress, up and over her, then his hand curved around her and slid down, his impossibly long arm allowing him to reach her very hot and aching core. A cry of pure bliss erupted from her as he stroked her firmly through her panties. Continued to stoke her firmly, getting faster as she pushed her hips back against him, moving against his fingers, moaning into his ear. Oh goddess, she was seeming, her hands gripping his arms tightly as she gasped his name, heard him growl deeply as she came under his touch. Was underneath him a second later, his mouth on hers, ravaging hers as his hand was pulling her dress all the way off, down her body. His mouth followed the dress, hungrily. She cried out. Her eyes opened and found him watching her. His eyes were on her hands, as his mouth bit into the inner side of her knee. Her dress was gone, his mouth was hot and she could feel nothing but her need for him, could smell his desire for her, filling her, breathed it in and moaned as his mouth moved up the inside of her thigh slowly, his eyes now on hers. She was watching him and he her. Goddess, she was going to drown in those blue eyes. Felt his teeth bite down on her inner thigh, his and sliding up slowly, firm but gentle, her head fell back. Please, she moaned. Soon, he whispered, trailing slow hot kisses up her leg. She was hot and on fire. His mouth hit the scar on her inner thigh, bit it, and it was like a bucket of ice water fell over her. Her eyes opened in a flash as the memory of Felicia hit her hard, fighting Darwin as he tried to force her, the newborn twin between her thighs, covered in her blood, from that scar. Tears burned her eyes. Stop, she gasped, pain filling her, the tears spilling down. She yanked herself away from him, up the bed, trying to get out from underneath him. He stopped instantly and looked up at her, lifted his whole body to allow her to pull away from him. It's okay, he said softly. I'm sorry, she whispered. She did want him and now she'd ruined it. Sat staring at him. Hey, it's okay, he said gently, moved himself up and next to her on the bed, put his arms around her slowly and held her. Whatever it is. I'm sorry, Nick, I do want to, I'm sorry. She buried her face into his chest and then hugged him. He held on to her for a long time, then his voice, soft and gentle, asked how'd you get the scar. My Luna cut me, she whispered, and a sob escaped her. Why? She shook her head, more tears spilled, and she hugged him so tight to her, needed him for comfort to make them smell like me, she whispered some time later. He was quite for a long time the twins. She nodded yes, to protect them, from him. Lucinda could feel one hand stroking through her hair, and the other was rubbing her back gently. You did protect them, he reassured her. Nick, I didn't understand, she shook her head. Understand what? He asked quietly. What did it? A sob escaped her, her heart breaking. They're my babies, and I gave them away. Her whole body was racked with sobs. She felt him hug her into him even tighter, lay her down on the bed and just held onto her, until she stopped sobbing. I'm sorry. Nick sighed softly. I didn't know, the blood bonding book you read. She nodded, I don't know what to do about them, and she honestly didn't. Do whatever you need to. I will support your decision. She tilted her head up to look at him, even if I want them here. Yes, he nodded, looking right into her eyes, he meant it. I'm sorry, she told him. Looking right back at him. For what? He asked. I ruined everything. They had had a really nice night and she'd gone and ruined it. She hadn't wanted to ruin it. No, you didn't, he smiled down at her gently. We have all our lives too. He grinned a little at her. Made each other. Why don't we just snuggle up and get some sleep for now? Lucinda nodded. I'm sorry, she whispered, she really was. Got under the covers when he encouraged her to, watched as he slipped off his suit pants and got back into the bed. She moved into his arms when he held them out for her. Try and get some sleep. Does it bother you? No. I'm glad you told me. Explains a little about you. Your reaction too, he trailed off. I'm glad you told me, I want you to tell me everything, when you're ready. Lucinda nodded. I will, Nick, soon, she said softly, and really did mean it. 83. Nick POV. Nick lay there in the dark. Lucinda had finally fallen asleep, her head was resting on his chest, as it always did on his tattoo of rib. One arm was stretched out across him, curled around his rib cage. She had not even attempted to let him go. So much pain had ripped through her twice today now. She was opening up to him finally. But it was causing her pain, on an emotional level, and it was hard for him to have to hear that amount of pain in her voice. See and hear her tears and sobs. Every time she hurt, his heart ached for hers too. Rib, though awake at this moment, was also quiet, his head on his paws just lying there, felt a little sad for their mate. As did Nick. The Luna had cut her, had to be Felicia, had done it to make the twins smell like Lucinda and not Felicia. Had blood bonded the twins to Lucinda, it seemed, and on purpose. Knew she was going to die, he thought. That was the only way to protect her own daughters from an alpha, was to change their scent and hide them from him. So Darwin had come for Felicia then. Maybe he had wanted her for himself, and she had belonged to another, had killed her mate and son just to get to her. Had he wanted her dead, or did the man want her for himself? And if that was the case, it was likely she had died fighting him off. One crazed alpha on a mission to take what he wanted, probably took every warrior in his pack, just to get to her. Her death, if that was not what he wanted, could well have set him off into a complete rage. His or not, if he had wanted to claim her and not have her dead, her death would have surely enraged him. Likely took it out on the rest of her pack. Didn't know about the twins, if he found out. Those two little girls would have been in danger from him, as much as Lucinda would be. Possibly even more so. No wonder Lucinda trained so darn hard all her life. She was in training to take down an alpha wolf. Even wolf-less, Nick believed, she would have challenged him, attacked him. All to protect the twins, her sisters. He sighed softly into the darkness of the room around him, her daughters. Bled into her, unbeknownst to her. Felicia had known what she was doing, but Lucinda had no actual knowledge of it at the time. Had not known what Felicia had done that day, it was likely there was probably no time to explain it to her either. He wondered how old they had been. When it had happened, from what he did know, the girls were 8. So had been born that year. Wouldn't even remember Luna Felicia at all. Too young and being blood bonded to Lucinda. That would override their bond to their birth mother. It was a risky move to make. But it would likely also have stopped them from feeling her death at the time as well. If Felicia had survived that day, she had given up all rights to her twin daughters. Even if she took them back and never told Lucinda what had been done, the connection to the twins would be stronger with Lucinda than Felicia. That thought could only lead him to one possible conclusion, no matter the outcome. Felicia knew she was not going to survive. She was expecting to die that day. But she was not, or had not been expecting her women and children to die. Thought they would make it out alive. How did Lucinda and the twins make it out alive? That was the question. Nick was going to have to wait for her to tell him. She had told him tonight that she would, and soon. He knew she would, had pretty much outed herself with what she had told him. Lucinda wasn't dumb, she would have to know. He knew she wasn't talking about Lindy, therefore another Luna. His hand was absently stroking her hair. How much more was there to her story? He knew there was more, had to be. There was nothing he could do about it, but wait. Nick closed his eyes and tried not to think about it, clear his mind and allow sleep to claim him. It didn't really happen, not for a long time, too much information he'd learned today, yet there were still missing pieces of the puzzle it seemed. His eyes snapped open and his whole body was filled with hot electric bolts shooting all over his body, from his neck down. Moved his eyes right to hers, felt her fingers slide down off of his neck over his collarbone and down onto his chest. He was fully aroused and looking right at what he wanted, growled at her. She had been touching his mark spot, it was the only explanation for how hot and hard his body was right this minute. She also knew what it would do to him. She had touched him there on purpose and he knew it. She was looking right up at him, biting that lower lip of hers. Woman was teasing and taunting him. "Morning," she said, and her all soft and husky. He hugged her, voice was her body was relaxed against his, her head back on his shoulder again. "You're amazing," he told her softly. Never before had he ever been satisfied like this. Nothing would ever compare to her. To how she made him feel. "Goddess Nick," she sighed back at him. Nick shifted her off him, gently and lay down with her, pulled her into his arms. "You're never going to stop my hands now," he teased her. She sounded tired to him. "Sleepy?" he asked, with a smile. She nodded against his chest. "Sleep then, my dear," he told her gently, sated completely it seemed. She would likely need it, Nick thought, his hand brushing some of her sweaty hair off her face. He was going to want more of that. Loved being an alpha right now. Loved that he could please her and so many times, with barely any rest needed. Rip, he noted, was lying in his mind all stretched out and felt very happy, to Nick. Mated her good. Rip yawned. We did." He felt Rip turn his head and close his eyes, happy to sleep it seemed, all alpha wolfed out it seemed. Nick smiled. Turned and looked at her asleep on his chest. He'd ravished his tiny mate, she'd asked him to take it slow last night, but the alpha in him just couldn't do it, it seemed. Wanted and had claimed her. Only had to mark her now, and she would be his for always and ever. He smiled to himself. It shouldn't take that long. He thought she was really open to him and definitely wanted him. His beautiful Luna wanted him. A Frost. 84. Lucinda POV. Lucinda woke up to find her ached body half stretched out on top of Nick. She was flooded with the memories of them mating, turned her face slowly to look at him. Did the man ever sleep? He smiled right at her, her heart fluttered instantly. Goddess, he was so handsome. Afternoon, he teased her. She buried her head in his chest. Hi, she murmured, a little embarrassed. She'd never had S*X like that before, didn't even know she had it in her to be like that. Heard him chuckle softly, gone all shy. Nick teased her and she felt his hand slide up her back slowly. Want to ride me again? Goddess Nick, she lifted her eyes to him, is that all you can think about? He nodded with a grin. We're going to live in this bed now. She whacked him. Who's going to run your pack? Jeremy can, he laughed. Lucinda pushed herself up off of him. Realized she was not under the sheet, she was completely ached in front of him as he was her. He seemed very comfortable with his acheness. Turned at the sound of her phone chiming, and turned over to reach out and get it, only to find Nick pinning her down to their bed and growling no in her ear. She laughed and reached her arm out for it anyway, just missing it by a couple of inches. Nick, come on, it could be important. He snorted at her. I'm the most important person in the pack. So it's not? He was biting her shoulder playfully. Might be Lindy, she giggled as her statement elicited a growl from him. She tried to wriggle out from underneath him, made him chuckle. Yes, do that. He was wriggling on top of her now. Lucinda laughed. Stop it, you bloody horny bastard. Always, he growled playfully at her now. Nick, please, could be Gabby about the twins. She was still trying to reach for her phone. Fine, he muttered, burying his face in her neck. He reached out for the phone, his arms much longer than hers. The minute his fingers touched the screen, her home screen lit up. She thought as that picture of him sitting in that very tiny chair at Granny's house popped up for all to see. She tried desperately to grab her phone before he could see it, but only had one hand free and his arm was too long. Her sudden movement lifted his head. What the? He growled, now annoyed. And pushed himself up onto his elbows. She was still trapped underneath him. She knew he was looking at it. Lucinda couldn't help but laugh when she looked up at him. It really was just too funny to look at. Oh, you think it's funny? She was yanked over and he was staring right down at her now. She just laughed even harder. His expression matched the one in the photo. It's too funny, Nick, she burst out. She really did need a printed copy so she could frame it. Oh, is it? He tossed her phone away. Not Gabby. Hey, she tried to reach for it again. Found herself rolled all the way over again and 2 hard whacks to her bottom were delivered. Oh, she gasped. He'd just s**d her. Not so funny now, hey, though he sounded fully amused to her. I'm telling Granny. She'll wallop you good. Lucinda couldn't help it, knew it was likely to only incur more punishment. He leaned right down against her ear. Oh, you want to play? He teased her. I have handcuffs here somewhere. Lucinda bit her lip. You wouldn't, but he probably would, she thought. Wouldn't I? You don't know, he growled at her. No, she shook her head. I'll tell Lindy. Your mother will come and chastise you. Oh, I'm so getting into trouble, she thought and chuckled. Oh. That's it, handcuffs it is, he growled and was off her. Lucinda tried to scramble up off the bed, only to find his hand around her ankle, and was pulled across the bed to the other side as he moved. She clearly weighed nothing to him. Nope, punishment will be dealt, to my naughty mate, he told her. He actually produced a set of handcuffs to her horror and waved them at her, watched as he opened one and reached out to snap it around her wrist. She snapped both hands to her chest. No, she shook her head. You might like it, he grinned at her and moved to cuff her again. He'd let go of her ankle. Lucinda gasped, he was really going to do it. He was grinning right at her. Wanted to, she realized, snapped her hands out and grabbed them from him, using Kyra's speed. As she put her foot on his chest and shoved him away, he tumbled backwards on the bed and she shot up onto her feet, launched herself at him and snapped the cuff around his own wrist, then jumped off him before he even realized what was happening, was off the bed and smashing the other end to the bed post. She stood laughing out of arm's reach at his shocked expression. I win, she grinned at him. Nick rolled over onto his stomach and stared at her. Come back here. She laughed, had no idea where the key was, ran to the walk-in and yanked on a pair of shorts and a t-shirt. Don't you dare leave me here, he warned her as she ran for the bedroom doorway. I don't have a key, better ask Jeremy to help you, and she bolted from the room, right out of the suite laughing the whole way, used Kyra's speed to run down the stairs, banged right into Kevin, nearly fell over. Help, she laughed, bouncing on the balls of her feet. What did you do? He smiled at her. Handcuff him to the bed, saw him smell her, then just smile. She would smell like Nick, had yet to shower. Ain't no helping you, Luna. You'd better run for your life, he laughed. Where? She begged. I doubt you can hide from him. Saw his eyes glaze over and bolted in case it was Nick telling him to get her. Bolted all the way down the stairs, she didn't know where to go. Oh my dear, do you think you can hide from me? He practically purred down the mind link. Maybe, she answered, biting her lip, trying to think of a safe place, hit the ground floor. Goddess, he was going to send her out. Saw Jeremy and Brady both come out of the Alpha's office, looked right at her by the bottom of the staircase, looked her over and laughed. Probably still looked all messy from their mating, she realized. You got about a 5-minute head start. Jeremy told her, waving a key at her. Shit, she gasped and ran through the pack house laughing still. Pushed through the Omega exit and was about to head outside. Wait. He'd probably expect that, pulled off her clothes, rubbed them on her body in the hope of ridding his scent and putting it on the clothes, and then tossed them out the door to make it look like she had shifted and run off into the woods. I hope you're fast, my dear. Rip is going to enjoy this hunt. Kyra is already out and running away, good luck, she shot back and bolted up the Omega stairs all the way back to the Alpha floor. He would head outside, she thought, thinking Kyra was out running in the woods away from him. Slipped through the door to the Alpha floor after checking to see there was no one there and the hallway was clear. Ran back to their suite, her smell would already be in here, hiding here was the best choice. But where? She bit her lip and headed out to the balcony, closed the doors behind her and climbed into the pod chair after turning it away from the door. Heard the door chime, like 2 minutes later he's fast. I returned to the scene of the crime, I see. Lucinda bit her lip and didn't answer, he would track that instantly. Come on baby, I need to ask you good. The balcony doors burst open and he yanked the chair around, waved her clothes at her. You can't hide from me. She laughed up at him. I can try. He tossed her clothes on the ground. Come here. Then he reached in and pulled her up and out of the chair, strode back into their room and put her over his knee. How much punishment is needed for handcuffing your alpha to a bed, he mused aloud. Holding her down with a hand to the small of her back. Ached, she added, laughing while trying to wriggle free of his hold. he growled yes and ached and whacked her bottom 3 times, she gasped. It didn't really hurt, more turned her on than anything. No wonder Lindy tormented Alpha Corey to get S*D. His hand lingered on her A.SS after the 3rd hit, slid lower and she bit her L.P. as his finger suddenly started to stroke her. Sliding through her folds, a soft M0AN escaped her as his touch turned her on and pleasure rippled through her. This is a good punishment, he growled softly. She could hear the desire in his voice. Pleasure was coursing through her body as he stroked her, cried out when he pushed a finger inside her slowly and then started moving it in and out of her. He was still holding her in place on his lap with one hand while the other was moving now faster in and out of her till she was m0aning, his name as she maxed. He removed his finger from her and she looked up at him. He was smiling, punishment delivered. Then he got up and grabbed her hand. Shower with me. Lucinda was still a little breathless from her ASM, and just went with him, watched him strip off his clothes. He was fully aroused. She noted her eyes were looking right at his hard C0CK. Nick. Oh, we're not done. He yanked her over to him, picked her up and SSCD her, one hand in her hair, the other under her A.SS. Lucinda wrapped her legs around him instinctively, SSCD him back as he stepped them into the shower. His hands both moved to her A.SS and pulled her hard against him. I want you. I want you to, she m0aned and felt herself up against the shower wall, his mouth was hungry on hers, as he thrust into her right away. She clung to him, gasping and moving her body with his. Her nails digging into his back, his mouth was on her neck sing her hard, his teeth grazed her mark spot, she cried out as pleasure exploded through her entire body so strong, she started thrusting hard and fast, heard him gr0an in pain, but didn't stop. His mouth found hers, his body hard against her, his mouth moving over hers, demanding and hungry as she arched her back. Nick, she cried out, oh goddess, Nick. His pace quickened and her screams echoed in the bathroom as she maxed, his mouth again on her neck, sing and biting eagerly. Snarled, his head snapped back, his eyes on her, they were all alpha red. Out he suddenly roared at her, yanked his body from hers and physically shoved her out of the shower. Go now. He was losing control and she knew it. Nick. Go, he roared at her, saw him punch the shower wall, heard the tiles shatter and ran from the bathroom away from him. Dressed quickly and stood in the bedroom not knowing what to do. Biting her L.P., she'd seen rip right there with him. They wanted to mark her. He had shoved her away in order to stop himself. Trying to fight his need to mark her, fighting off his alpha instincts to fully claim her. He had enough wits about him to know he was losing control and send her away from him, before he lost it completely. She could hear him snarling and growling in the bathroom. It took several minutes before there was silence, another 10 before he came out of the bathroom altogether. His blue eyes found hers. I'm fine, he told her. Lucinda watched as he went to the walk-in and got dressed. When he came out, he sighed, I'm sorry. Nearly lost control. I saw. She nodded and bit her lower L.P. Are you okay? Yes, let's go downstairs and eat something. He walked over to her, laced his fingers through hers and led her out of the suite and down to the pack house dining room. He was very quiet, she noted. We're all good, he told her, but she didn't know, was he? He had definitely calmed down and was in full control of himself, had managed to push his need to mark her away. I'm sorry, she whispered, knowing it was her fault. Why? He asked, sounding a little surprised. She looked right up at him. It's my fault. I made the agreement. So it's not your fault. Way you're ready and not before. She sat with him at the alpha table, sipped a cup of coffee, his eyes were on her, he smiled suddenly. What? I like it when you're ached, he teased her openly for all to hear. Goddess. Even now, after what had just happened, he wanted more. She shook her head. You're insatiable. He laughed. I'm an alpha, my dear. Kind of goes with the territory. Jeremy, Kevin, and Brady all sat down at the table, all their eyes were on her. She blushed, her cheeks burned hot. They all knew Nick and she had been mating practically all day. Good to see you two getting along. Kevin leaned back in his chair. Nick chuckled, I'd say, more than getting along. His meaning was clear to all of them. Lucinda reached out and whacked him. He burst out laughing. Do I need to punish you again? Her eyes widened and she shook her head. No, I'm good. He smiled. Be good. She poked her tongue out at him, gasped, when he yanked her from her chair and pulled her onto his lap. Behave, or I'll SK you. Right here in front of everyone. Lucinda's eyes were wide now. Would he? She didn't know. Heard Jeremy laugh. Felt Nick's hand touch her face. She looked up at him and he SSCD her, right there in the pack house dining room for all to see. She sighed and leaned into him. Handsome man, she was never going to be able to resist him anymore. Sat on his lap and picked food off his plate to eat while he asked Jeremy how things in the pack had been today. 85. Nick POV. As much as Nick wanted to pull Lucinda's naked body on top of his and have his way with her again last night, he had refrained from doing so. He and Rip had nearly lost control yesterday afternoon in the shower with her. Even the pain that had burned him from his Alpa's oath had not stopped him the second time he'd felt it. He'd been mating her furiously, again. It seemed that just sex was out of the question, until she was marked anyway. He knew once he had placed his mark on her, his needs would ease off and his alpha's blood would calm down, as would his wolf. Rip was of little help, he wanted his mate. So his needs were also outweighing their alpha's oath or mating alliance for that matter. He was going to have to curb his appetite where she was concerned, still wanted her. Even now thinking it through, knowing he had to keep his hands to himself. A part of him was thinking about touching her, wanted to see her body writhing in ecstasy, at his very touch. He was going to have to keep himself in check the whole time, play with her, yes that seemed to be okay, gotta keep it, not allow himself to mate her until she agreed to be marked and then, he smiled well, he would mate out of her and sink his fangs deep into her right as she screamed his name. A lovely thought. Shook his head, was starting to get turned on. Told himself to stop thinking about it. Prayed she would let him mark her soon. He knew there were things she wanted to tell him, probably felt she needed to tell him before letting him mark her. Maybe she thought he would change his mind if he knew. Not going to happen. He might just have to sit her down tonight and ask her outright, she might now. Now they were mated. He would do it here in their suite before going to bed. Maybe while lying in the bed, whatever it was would likely be a good distraction. He was not likely to pull her clothes off and try anything after whatever she had to say, would just hug her, she would need it. He thought. Nick. Jeremy's voice came down the mind link, seemed a bit hesitant. Nick smiled, his beta didn't want to interrupt, it seemed. Yes, Jeremy. Are you busy today, boss, or are you training? I'll be down in like 5, Jeremy, he chuckled. I can run it again, if you and the Luna want to, he was laughing too. Not necessary. Nick smiled to himself and cut the link. Training might just help him get some of his energy out. He shifted her off of him. Seems his little mate liked sleeping on him. He smiled to himself, he liked it too. They had gone to sleep with his body snuggled around hers and he'd woken up with her on top of him. Really liked it. And once they were marked would make for easier morning play, he thought with a smile. His fingers were going to wake her every morning. What? She murmured as he moved her onto the bed. I've got training. Okay, she sat up and yawned, stretched her arms above her head and he nearly growled at her. Yes, he definitely needed to train, he thought to himself, his eyes on her. You can sleep in. Why? I haven't trained since I've been here. I want to train. She got up and out of their bed and headed for the walk-in. He didn't stop her. Nick followed, not the red ones, he commented as he watched her strip completely naked in front of him, not shy anymore, he thought, as he stripped and changed himself. Liked that she was comfortable around him, being naked. Though she was risking him mating her again by doing so. She looked at him, a smirk on her face. Knew what he was thinking really. She teased her hand, touched the red one in her draw and he let out a low growl. Lucinda laughed and pulled out a pair of blue 3/4 tights and a matching gym top. He frowned even at that, but said nothing when she raised an eyebrow at him. It was proper training attire and he knew it. He just didn't like that everyone out there was going to be able to see all her lovely curves. Shoes, he prompted, when she went to leave without them. We'll start with a 5K run today. Sweet. I like to run, hope you can keep up. She shot at him teasingly, a grin on her face. He couldn't help the smile on his face. He was really loving her new side, their bond now in full effect, it seemed. She was teasing him as much as he was her. I will, he told her. They arrived at the training ground together, with his alpha unit. His hand was in hers. It seemed he liked holding her hand. Everyone was already stretching and warming up. Nick saw several people looking at the two of them together. He smiled at them and nodded. It was good everyone was seeing them getting along. He kept his eyes off of her while she was stretching, could hear her chuckle and knew she could tell he was on purpose not watching her, seemed to be really enjoying her hold over him. Valerie came running onto the training ground, looking all breathless and right over to him, a hand on her heaving chest. Alpha, I'm sorry I'm late, she smiled right up at him. Go stretch, he dismissed her, without much thought. Didn't care she was late, but didn't think she had ever been late before. My friend fell down the stairs and broke her leg. I had to get her to the pack hospital. That gained his attention. It should have been reported, maybe the doctor would do it later. Fine Valerie. Move it. Nick heard Brady's voice with a hard edge to it. She turned and glared right at him. You can't tell me what to do, she yelled at him. I well can. Brady snarled at her. Everyone on the training ground was now watching what he saw. He can, Valerie. He is my Delta. Nick interrupted them, putting her right in her place. Brady did hold authority over her. As the pack Delta, he was the fourth in charge. Actually, he and Kevin were often in charge when Nick and Jeremy were off territory. She would know this. Seemed she needed reminding. He could see that the animosity between the two of them had not changed over the last few days. Go, he waved her off. Her eyes turned on him, there was a brief flash of anger in her eyes, before the look turned to be one filled with hurt at his comment. He ignored her and her look. Called everyone to attention. Started the run. Lucinda, he had noted, had been watching the interaction between him, Valerie and Brady with full interest and curiosity. It seemed he would have to explain to her what was going on, something to add to tonight's conversation, he supposed. Lucinda was fast, kept up with him easily. Come on Nick, you're not even trying, this is not running, she taunted him. He wasn't running, a fast jog for him basically. No one would keep up with him bar his alpha unit, and only Jeremy would actually be right on his heels. Kevin and Brady would fall behind, but only by a minute or two. Nick smiled at her, but said nothing. She was trying to provoke him into a challenge. He knew it. But the group of warriors behind them would never be able to keep up. He was actually setting a pace that was good for them all, just pushing them enough for them to be puffing. He could hear their breathing. Nick? She queried a moment later. No, he responded. Well, catch me if you can, she said, and ran off ahead of him up the trail, at full speed, Kyra clearly assisting her the whole way, wanting to run herself. He could only smile. Cheeky woman, knew he wasn't about to let her go, loved a good chase. Rip was already up in his mind, peering out at her through Nick's eyes, excitement filling him. Chase. Jeremy, take over, he looked at his beta. Go, he heard the amusement in Jeremy's tone. Nick shot off after her. Lucinda had a full 30-second head start, it wouldn't save her from him. He was gaining on her, though without Rip he realized he was unlikely to catch her at all. Kyra was indeed fast, even in human form. Might want to go faster, he shot down the mind link, amused by her. He and Rip both now wondered just how fast Kyra was in wolf form. Rip couldn't wait to have her shift and chase his mate. She was going to be hard to pin down, and he liked the thought of it. Cracked a hand right on her perfect as he caught up to her, grinned down at her and let Rip enhance all his speed, shot past her. She wanted to see who was faster, will show her. He hit the training ground before she did, though only about 10 seconds or so in front of her. He and Rip had heard Kyra growl at them as they had gone past her. It was all Kyra in pursuit after that, and found himself crash-tackled to the ground by her the moment she caught up to him. She was right there on the surface, her green eyes glowing down at him. Both he and Rip looked up at her. You'll never outrun me in my wolf, she growled down at him as she sat right on him, then receded away. She liked chasing you. Lucinda smiled down at him. Nick smiled up at her. I can tell, he laughed, then pulled her face down to his, and yes Kyra, we will, he teased her. Wolf. So did Rip. He kissed her softly and then let her go, lay there allowing her to just sit on him. She was straddling his waist and looking very comfortable, he liked it. Then let them race each other, she smiled down at him. You're not one of those girls who are gonna get all grumpy and pouty now, if you lose, are you? He teased. He would let them race once marked, otherwise she might find herself marked by his wolf. He placed his hands behind his head and looked up at her, was enjoying not fighting with her for the first time ever. Lucinda pout down at him instantly, and she teased softly never, then chuckled and battered those long lashes at him. Oh, he and Rip were in trouble. He thought. Rip snorted. He didn't think so. It took a good 5 minutes more before Jeremy led the others into the training ground. Lucinda was still sitting on him. Caught him, I see, he laughed down at the two of them. I did. He's not so fast, she smirked and then got up and off him to his disappointment. I won. Nick corrected her. By like 10 seconds, she poked her tongue out at him. Still a win, he teased back and feinted at her. To his delight, she squealed and bolted behind Jeremy and Kevin, who were standing a few meters away just watching the two of them, and started laughing at him. He smiled right at her. They would not help her if he really wanted to get her. She was all his now, and his whole alpha unit knew it. Nick allowed everyone a breather and to hydrate after their run before pairing everyone up for hand-to-hand. Paired Lucinda up with Jeremy so they could actually see what she was made of, made sure to remind her that, other than using Kyra's speed, she was not be involved in the training. She nodded. He watched as the two of them, his Luna and his Beta, went toe-to-toe. She held her own, that was for sure. It took Jeremy quite a bit to actually pin her down and make her tap out, Near growled at the man for it, his Beta on top of his unmarked mate. But Jeremy got up the minute she tapped out, helped her up even. She looked a little more than ticked off about him besting her and called for a rematch. Jeremy grinned at her, he was up for the challenge, she might be fast, but the man was observant. Never once managed to get hit by that pointy elbow of hers, which she loved to smash into people, or the palm of her hand to the solar plexus either. Nick, as he watched the two of them, realized they were her go-to moves, probably because she was small and needed to hit where it hurt, more so than a larger, stronger person. She did manage to flip Jeremy over as she had Samson, but was unable to pin him down. Jeremy knew it was coming and was as fast as her. It seemed to Nick that the two were evenly matched. Which meant a full-on fight with her would not be fun at all. Jeremy could bring him down occasionally. So she was likely to be able to. The goddess had indeed granted him a gift, everything he wanted, strong and fast, a fierce warrior of a woman, with a beauty he didn't think anyone would ever match. Wondered if she took after the moon goddess herself. All the images of the goddess saw a dark-haired woman with the moon behind her. Lucinda was going to have to train with the Alpha unit, it seemed. He was proud of her and her skills, all of which she had learned and acquired while wolf-less. His Luna strong even without a wolf. He knew Kyra was and had no intention of ever going toe-to-toe with her wolf, that was for sure. Thought challenging Lucinda could be fun. He smiled to himself. Mate. Rip piped up. Yes, training with her would likely end up with him ripping her clothes off, he thought. Lucinda was amazing on the obstacle course, small and quick to crawl through the mud and under the low beams, a struggle for him and his size. Leaped over the hurdles easily, though he'd seen her do that in her old pack, with her bow on her back, ducked, rolled and weaved and launched herself at every obstacle with relish, it seemed. Really did like training, it seemed. Actually, completed the course ahead of everyone, including him and the Alpha unit. Stood there at the end, her arms folded across her chest, smiling up at them all. Slow pokes, she taunted them all. You'll keep, he grinned at her, and snagged her around the waist for a hug, pulled her into his chest. He didn't care who saw. Training was over the minute the last of his warriors completed the course. He noted Valerie glaring at Lucinda in his arms. She was one of the first few to finish the course. Lucinda was leaning comfortably against him, their mate bond on full display for all to see, heard a growl come from her, looked down at her to see she was looking right at Valerie herself. Had noted the woman glaring at her. He tightened his arms around her reassuringly. She's of no threat to you, he mind-linked her. We don't like her. I can see that, he acknowledged. He didn't much like the way Valerie had looked at his mate like that either. I've pulled her into line, and Brady is on her. What's her problem? She snarled down the line, sounded very possessive to him. Liked it? Not sure. Still trying to figure that one out. I can put her in her place. No need, I did that already. Let's go shower. He practically purred the last three words. Watched her look up at him, saw a bit of worry cross her face. Probably need to do that separately, she murmured down the mind link. Pity, he replied to her aloud, but did know she was right, most likely. Until she was marked anyway, then he was going to have her naked body everywhere in that suite. He couldn't help but smile to himself as they walked back to the pack house. "What?" she asked him. Just thinking about," his voice trailed off, allowed his eyes to slide over her mud-covered body, still looked perfect to him. Saw her blush, oh he liked that. "I'm gonna have you. The minute you let me mark you," right in front of a mirror he told her through the mind link. Her eyes turned on his so wide now. "Oh yes, my dear, I like to watch," he told her, "and I am going to." "Nick," she gasped, somewhat shocked, it seemed. "I'm going to put mirrors everywhere in our bedroom," he teased her, but was really honestly considering it. "No," she gasped. "Yes," he said out loud and tried to grab her. She ran away from him and he laughed softly, watched as he walked, as she ran for the pack house, let her go. So she could shower without him. Probably a wise decision, on both their parts. Though he did want to rip her clothes off and have his way with her. Heard his whole unit chuckle, turned to look at them. "Good to see you two getting along." Kevin smiled right at him. "She feels happy, Nick," he added. Nick smiled at his gamma good. He did like having a gamma who could use those gifts of his to see how his Luna was feeling. Nick got to show her, her office space that morning after breakfast. The carpet she had chosen was fully laid. She liked it, it was deep pile and soft underfoot. He was wearing shoes but knew by the way it felt that walking on it barefoot would be nice. All the walls were now freshly painted too, that cream color she had chosen. He watched as she walked about. The two large windows were going in at that very moment. She looked into the demolished bathroom, nodded her head and said she liked it. His heart quickened when she smiled up at him. "So, can I patrol today? Kyra is itching to be out." Nick sighed, and waved her into his office. He didn't want to fight with her and wasn't about to even get into a heated discussion with her. In front of the builders, she leaned on his desk and waited for his reply. "I thought we'd wait, I haven't sorted out the roster for that." "Oh, come on Nick. Just one shift, put me with anyone you want," she replied. Apparently now willing to team up on patrol, that was good, because he didn't want her out there on her own. "What shifts do you run?" she asked him. 3 8-hour shifts, he told her, saw her glance at the clock and sigh. She was already thinking about the next shift. It seemed, "Which shift do you want?" he asked her. He didn't want to fight with her about it. They were finally happy, so at least being open to discuss it should continue to keep her in a good mood. "Kyra loves the night shift." "That would be 10 p.m. to 6 am," he told her. "I don't particularly want you on that shift." "Why?" she asked right back. He knew she'd been on the night shift back in her old pack. Nick smiled right at her, let his eyes wander over her body slowly, pointedly, and she giggled, knew exactly what he was thinking, he was making it clear. Fine, already suspected as much. She surprised him. "What about the 2 to 10 shift then?" "Kyra loves to be out under the moon." Nick nodded, with her type of wolf known to him now. It didn't surprise him that Kyra was a night wolf. Her on the afternoon shift would give him the chance to work in his office, catch up on his duties and still go to bed with her, and train with her in the mornings as well. "All right," he finally agreed. "Excellent. I'll go and get ready." She was off his desk and heading for the door. It was barely 10 am and she was clearly ready to go. "I didn't agree to you patrolling today," he commented. "You will." She turned at the door and winked at him. "I'll find a way to make you." Her voice was suddenly soft and seductive. "Wait. Wait." He smiled, she was going to seduce him into it seemed. "Fine, but just today. Then you and Kyra can wait till the new roster next week." She stood tapping her lips, a slight smile on her face. Nick growled at her, it wouldn't take much for him to drag her back into bed. She was gone, running away. He could hear her laughing. Woman, he muttered. You two are just too cute. Jeremy teased him. Shut it. Nick huffed, he did want to follow her and pull her underneath him. Shook his head and stayed put. So, patrolling, hey? I guess so. Nick nodded, just trying not to start a fight with her. Western Border Patrol 2, doesn't see much action, Jeremy commented. Nick nodded, neither did Section 1, he thought. Checked the roster. Paulina was on this afternoon. A good warrior, he thought, and linked her to tell her she would have company on patrol. She wasn't fazed at all, just gave confirmation of his order. He would walk her out there himself. It would take an hour or more to get out there, a nice stroll for the two of them to chat and spend time together after lunch. Wondered how she would feel about him laying down a few ground rules. Thought better of it. That section of patrol was very unlikely to see any more than 1 or 2 rogues a week, and most could be deterred. Some didn't even come close, just walked on by, in wolf or human form, looked at the roaming patrol and moved on. He'd had the occasional one ask for sanctuary and been willing to be cuffed with silver and presented to him. Mostly they were still young with not so nice stories of how they'd become rogues. Most of the time, he would accept them with a year of probation. Then, if they had caused no trouble and been well behaved, he would fully initiate them into the pack. 86. Lucinda POV. Finally able to patrol, even Kyra was excited at the prospect of being out. Though both of them knew Nick wasn't about to let her go on her own. Or be on a border that was likely to see any action at all, but still it was a start. She would convince him to let her patrol every day, probably wouldn't take much. The man was always eyeing her off. A little teasing and tempting, a promise of something later on to come, would likely do it. She smiled to herself. Shook her head slightly. Don't think about it, she told herself. The man was amazing in bed. Bit her lip, not even Matthew was that energetic or needy. She did not know how she was going to handle Nick every day. Loved it. Kyra chortled at her. Lucinda had really loved it, the way he had wanted her. His need for her. Goddess, such a turn on. The man, it seemed, did not need rest and could make her so hot and wanton, that she hadn't wanted it to stop either. We can handle our mate. Kyra piped up. Made for him. What are you thinking about? She heard Nick growl from next to her. They were walking down a trail to her patrol point. Nothing, she bit her lip. Oh, Lucinda. I can smell your arousal, he growled softly. Sorry, she glanced up at him, through slightly lowered lashes. Oh, don't be, he smiled right back at her. If you want, we can go. No, no, she cut him off hurriedly. I want to patrol. Nick chuckled softly. Are you sure about that? Lucinda nodded. Yes, she stated flatly. He was amused and she could see it. Walked her all the way to the patrol border and introduced her to a she-wolf, Paulina, who she'd be patrolling with, and then looked right down at her. Behave, he told her softly, but meant it. We're good on patrol, Lucinda told him. I'll wait till you shift, he said. Just want to see me naked, she shot down the mind link. Saw him smile but say nothing as she pulled her clothes off. His eyes were on her, she had not been wrong. She rolled her eyes at him and let Kyra shift them. To her surprise, he walked over and hunkered down right in front of them. Touched Kyra's head, he ran his hand up and over her head, scratched her behind her ears. Hey beautiful, he addressed her. Wolf, you behave too. Kyra snored at him, unable to communicate with him in her wolf form until they were marked by him. But she was definitely enjoying his gently scratching behind her ears. Then all of a sudden she barged her head into him, knocking him to the ground and stood right over him, peered down at him for a good 10 seconds, then just turned and pranced away to the waiting patrol wolf. They heard him laugh softly as he got up and left. Just had to play with him. Lucinda chuckled. Yes. Kyra retorted, playing with mate is fun. Yes, and it was, Lucinda thought. I like our mate. Kyra told her. Me too. Lucinda sighed, and she did. About time. Kyra snored at her. It was just on dusk, the sun setting in the western sky when pain ripped through her and Kyra, so bad it was, that Kyra stumbled and fell down. Every part of her body was screaming at her, waves of pain rolling over her continually. Kyra howled in pain and Lucinda was forcibly shifted back to her human form. Laying on the ground clutching at her body, pain tearing at her insides, it felt like 1,000 knives stabbing into her, cutting into her most private part, repeatedly. She knew it wasn't real, but the pain was very real. No, she thought he wouldn't. Her mark spot was burning so hot it felt like it was on fire and felt as though it was being ripped off of her body. Tears were spilling down her face. She tried to get up, couldn't, stumbled and fell to her knees. Why? She didn't understand. Everything was good between them now. Really good. Kyra was screaming inside her mind, pitching a fit, scratching everything, her pain too great to handle. Ah, and now you know the truth, a voice told her. She looked up through her tears. Paulina was standing before her. I wondered when he would claim Valerie and dismiss you as trash. The woman was actually smiling down at her, enjoying her pain, it seemed. He wouldn't. Lucinda shook her head, didn't want to believe it, even though she could feel it, her own body reacting to what he was doing with another. He is, you can feel it yourself. He's mating her right now. Paulina kicked her all the way down to the ground and looked down at her. Once he marks her, you'll be nothing. She started to laugh. Won't take long now, he's been itching to do it for a while now. Kyra snarled up at her, rage filling her. Their mate was cheating on them. They could feel it. He just wanted a taste of you first, make it hurt you more when he takes another. Viscous those frost men are. Love dishing out the pain, the greater it is the more they like it. She laughed mirthlessly. Valerie will be the Luna, always was going to be. He chose her long before you came along. Lucinda didn't want to believe it. He wouldn't do that to her, promised her he wouldn't. Tried to reach out to him with the mind link to get answers from him. It couldn't be true. The mind link wouldn't connect on his end. Kyra was going ballistic now inside her mind, snarling and growling in her anger. She did not want to be contained anymore, as Lucinda lay on the ground trying to bear the pain, to endure it. The tears wouldn't stop, the pain was intensifying with every second. It was true, she couldn't deny it, could feel it herself. They heard Paulina's laughing, she sounded so happy about what was going on, and that was it. Kyra was out of her, launched herself directly at that she-wolf, buried her teeth right into the woman's throat, no warning given. Ripped her throat clean out. Snarled and started ripping into her body, tearing it to shreds in her pain at his, their mate's betrayal. Then she ran, full speed, right off pack territory and out into rogue country, away from him. Away from his pack. Away from the pain and everything he was to them. They would never come back. Fury built inside her with every wave of pain. It built more till there was no pain left and only pure rage was left. Kyra ran full speed, killing everything in her path, no matter how big or small, no matter if there was more than one. it didn't matter. She saw nothing but blood to be tasted, blood her only thought. She wanted blood and she would have it from everything and anything. Tonight, she was death and she would deliver it without mercy to all who crossed her path. Then she just stopped at some point. It was completely dark, the moon in the sky. Had no idea how long she had run and terrorized everything in her path of pure destruction. So filled with pain and devastation. Looked right up at that moon and howled loud and mournful, sounded broken. Then just lay down, shifted, and Lucinda was left naked on the ground in the middle of rogue territory, hugging herself, sobbing uncontrollably. She'd finally let him in, was ready to tell him everything about herself, and he had betrayed them. Did what his father and both his brothers before him had done. He was just like them. Told her he wasn't, but he really was. If she had been marked by him, she wouldn't be alive right now. Would have bled out just like his own mother had. His alpha oath not to mark her, the only thing it seemed, that had saved her life right now. No wonder he agreed to do it. He'd never wanted to in the first place. Lucinda pushed herself up off the ground. Looked around her, her tears had finally stopped, as had her sobs. There were 3 dead rogues around her, she'd been lying in their blood, was covered in it. Home, her singular thought, did not know where she was in regard to it. Kyra, she asked her wolf, who was still in pain. Had receded to the very far reaches of her mind of no help, it seemed. Still hurt by her mate's betrayal. Lucinda closed her eyes, hugged her arms around her naked blood-caked body and tried to focus on her home, to recall. She had been on the Western Patrol, which meant her home was out this way. Maybe more south, maybe she didn't know. Opened her eyes and looked around her. At least the pain in her body had stopped, she had stopped feeling the pain of his betrayal. Was she too far away, or had he finished marking and mating Valerie, that she-wolf who'd sized her up at every turn? Now Lucinda understood her comment from the other day, you might in a day or two. Clearly, her and Nick had already discussed when they would, no. She shut her mind off, didn't want to even think about it. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes and thought about her pack, the White Lotus pack, tried to sense it out for herself. Turned around slowly, her feet sticking a bit in the congealed rogue blood underfoot. There a tiny glimmer of light, a connection long ago established through her birth to her pack's land, and she headed for it. They would go home. He would not come for her, now he had chosen another. Nor did he even know where her home was. She had never told him. She walked uncaring, she was in rogue territory, was covered in dried rogue blood, bits of mud and grass, likely bits of all the animals Kyra had destroyed in her bloodlust-filled killing spree. She saw a few rogues in both human and wolf form, they all seemed to just back away from her when she turned her eyes on them, seeking her head to the side as she did so. It was likely their instincts were telling them it would be a death sentence to come near her. Probably looked like and smelt like death herself. Every time her hand or arm came into contact with any part of her body, it would stick to her slightly before pulling away again, and the smell of rotten congealed blood would waft to her nose. She could feel her hair was stuck to her body all down her back and arms, across her chest, it was as covered in blood and guts as was the rest of her. Probably looked like a walking corpse, she thought. It was well after midnight when she felt herself, her feet connect with the earth that was her pack. Sank down on the ground a few steps in and sobbed again. This was her home now. She would never leave it again. It was where she'd been born, where she had belonged, mated to its alpha, would have always been here. Where she had been meant to live out the rest of her life. Kyra, it seemed, had vanished. Lucinda couldn't even feel her, so far back in her mind was just a tiny shadow of herself. She had wanted her mate. It was all she had ever wanted, and he'd betrayed her. She was unable to cope with it. Closed herself off from the world they lived in, from Lucinda herself, it seemed, didn't want to feel any of it anymore. Lucinda couldn't blame her, she herself didn't want to feel it either, but had to bear it, seeing as she had survived it. Like that last time, somehow she was created to survive no matter what happened to her. How she would go on she didn't know at that point. What she would do from here on out she also didn't know. Was all alone now. Her fate, it seemed, to be alone always. She looked at her wrist, his alpha oath was still there marring her skin, would likely remain forever and always. A thing to remind her of him and what he'd done. Why didn't it go away? She was suddenly rubbing at it furiously, wanted it gone from her skin, it should have gone away when he marked another. She was clawing at it, ripping at her skin, trying to tear it from her body. It was no use. He had branded her for life, it seemed. She watched as the skin slowly healed and it remained intact. His oath would remain unbroken. Because he would never mark her, he had chosen another. For the rest of her life she would have to see it. Remember his betrayal and never be allowed to forget it. Paulina had told her the more pain a frost man caused, the more they liked it. He truly was cruel, had fooled her completely, and now he was her burden to bear. Finally, she trusted him only to have him show his true colors. Now she, too, was a part of the Frost family legacy, it seemed. Getting up from the ground, she walked further into her territory, washed herself clean in the reserve where the lotus flowers grew and then just sat there in the water surrounded by her lotus flowers. This was where she belonged. Here in her pack, her home. The only place she had ever wanted to be. Watched as the flowers started to open with the first rays of sunlight, though could not feel happy to be there. Did not feel anything. Numbed now, as she saw them all start to bloom around her, an amazing sight she knew she loved, felt nothing. Not even her childhood memories of growing up here, wading in the water with her mother, this very reserve of water to pick these flowers brought her any emotions. She knew that her life here had been happy, peaceful, but now she felt nothing at all. Not even sadness at the fact this was her home long ago destroyed, a ruined piece of land that no one wanted to come near. They thought it was haunted. Well, now it truly was. Haunted by her, she would kill and destroy anything that came here. She would haunt this place and never leave it again. One day she would die here, just like she should have died here all those years ago. She was the ghost of the White Lotus pack. An inhumane laugh bubbled up inside of her, her skin was so pale, she could actually pass for a real ghost. Maybe this was always what she was meant to be. 87. Nick POV. Nick mind-linked Paulina every 30 minutes to check on Lucinda and Kyra. He could feel her annoyance come back to him down the mink link. She's fine. The woman had snapped at him on the 5th time he asked about her. He didn't want Lucinda to know he was checking up on her, knew it would start a fight or at least she would be angry with him, and he wanted to get her talking about her past tonight, so he could finally mark her. Nick knew he was being a complete pain in the, but he couldn't help it. Had this need to make sure she was all right. Warned Paulina to watch her tone and attitude, reminded her he was the alpha and she would do as he told her. Kevin and Jeremy were off looking for Brady. The man, it seemed, had vanished completely. 2 hours ago, not even Nick could establish a mind link to him. It was really weird. Valerie, it seemed, had lied this morning at training, about her friend having broken her leg and being in the pack hospital. There had been no report come through to him, and so he'd checked with Emerson himself. No one with a broken leg today. Brady had snarled his annoyance with her and snapped he was going, to go and bring her in once he found her. It was her day off. But he had never returned and no one, it seemed, had seen him anywhere in the past 2 hours either. It was concerning. What if Brady had turned on her? She had rejected him at 18 and there was now a real hatred between them, it seemed. If the two of them got into a physical altercation, Brady would outmuscle her easily, and could kill her. Seemed like he currently wouldn't have a problem with it, at all. But if he did, would it affect him? Killing one's mate could not only devastate, but send a wolf into an insane pain-filled spiral, that could lead them to killing themselves, or just go completely crazy, bolt off into rogue territory, and remain insane, for the rest of their life. Nick tried again to reach the man, forced all his alpha power into the mind link, knowing it would hurt the man. Hopefully, cause him pain on such a level, it would make the link connect and stabilize, long enough to ask him where he was, or even get a location on him. Nothing. The tether was there in his mind, but not like a normal tether, it was fuzzy and fluctuating on and off. Nick was unable to establish a solidly connected link to his delta. Couldn't even get a read on his location, or even a direction, due to the instability of the link and tether to him. Which in itself was very odd, as the alpha, Nick could use that tether in his mind to attach himself to any pack member and feel in his mind, their direction and, if close enough, their actual location. Yet he was now unable to. Jeremy. Any luck? Nothing, boss. It's like he just disappeared. Weird thing is, I can kind of nearly reach him but then, can't, it's not stable and won't connect. Nick finished for him. Yes. It's the same as what I am getting. Can you send him? No. That's the other weird thing. I tracked him right to Valerie's place. Then just nothing, like he never left. Kevin having any luck? No. It's the same for him too. Something is off, boss. I got this real bad feeling. I know. Nick agreed. Keep looking. He mind-linked Kevin to see what he was up to. Kevin. I can't find Valerie, boss, nothing. It's like she and Brady just disappeared. Nothing. Neither of them left her place. Neither of them. He knew Jeremy was searching for Brady and Kevin was hunting Valerie. Sense masked maybe? Nick wondered down the mind link to his gamma. That would actually explain a lot, in not being able to send her out, boss. Keep trying. Yes, boss. That would indeed explain a lot about the current situation. If their scents were masked, no one would be able to track them. Nick couldn't see a reason why Brady would do such a thing though, it wasn't like him. Even if he was going to track Valerie he would have let Nick know first. Odd. Masking one's scent, however, would not have an effect on the mind link or the tether. He should still be able to use that. The man had not rejected the pack, that would affect the mind link and tether, they would instantly be severed from Nick, but he would have felt it snap. So that did not happen either. Nick sighed, he tried to mind link Valerie, her link was there but didn't connect, did not feel fuzzy or fluctuate like Brady's. But he was being stopped by something, he pushed his aura down the line, nothing. Tried to catch her tether, but it would not connect either. Something was definitely going on. Though there was a definite difference in the feeling to her and Brady, the result was the same. He was being blocked from interacting with them, in any way. Something was definitely going on. Jeremy was right about that, he too was having a very bad feeling about the situation. At least he knew Lucinda was all right. Paulina was with her and she'd report to him she was fine. Just minutes ago. Thought about linking to Lucinda himself, but decided against it. She might pick up on something was wrong and, being the Luna, would want to help in all likelihood. She was safe out there on patrol. He would leave it that way. Once he knew what was going on, if necessary, he would bring her in. But he didn't need to. He and his unit could handle it. Nick got up from his chair. It was time that he and Rip joined the search, it seemed. Not that they would have any better luck with Brady's scent masked. But Rip could cover a lot of ground quickly. His eyes moved to his office door. It stood open as it always did when he was in here. He blinked as Valerie appeared in the doorway, banged hard into the door jamb and stumbled right into his office. Looked like she had been running fast to get here. He saw right away she had blood running down her neck and shoulder, looked at him all wide-eyed, appeared scared and frightened to him. "Alpha!" she burst out, stumbling right over to him. One hand was outstretched to him. "What happened?" he asked, stepping over to her. Had Brady actually attacked her and injured her? He frowned. Her outstretched hand latched onto his right arm and she stepped right to him. Nick's head snapped back as he smelled her. That was Lucinda's blood on her. He could smell it, now that she was up close to him. Rip snarled instantly, worried about their mate. "Why is the Luna's blood on you?" he demanded to know. It had just been reported that she was fine and well. How could this be? There was no way she could have gotten here in just minutes. It was over an hour for someone like her, and that blood looked fresh, was still damp on her skin, smelled fresh, not old. Was bright red, not dark brown like old blood would be. He felt a sharp sting in his left abdomen, his head whipped around and down to see what had just happened. To his complete shock, there was a syringe in her hand, and she held it in him. It was empty. She had already injected him, with whatever was in it. He blinked and shook his head. Whatever it was already starting to affect him. Felt kind of fuzzy in his head. "What?" he roared, and tried to step away from her, felt himself stumble, tried to grab the syringe and remove it but couldn't seem to get hold of it, shook his head and tried again. It was removed from him by her. "Just give it a minute, Nick, baby, it won't take long," she told him. His heart was racing and his breathing increased, his eyes moved to her, he tried to pull away from her out of her grip. Felt weak, shook his head, blinked several times. Gasped as he staggered, felt very disorientated and saw his vision start to get blurry. He couldn't see her properly anymore, saw her move towards him. "It's me, Nick," Lucinda as she slid her hand along his arm. "Smell me," she told him. He felt himself swaying on his feet, tried to understand what was happening to him, but couldn't seem to think straight, couldn't clear his head, fell to his knees. She was right there in front of him, his eyes were becoming heavy and her face was distorted in his vision. When he could look to her, the smell of Lucinda's blood all around him now, consuming his mind. Grabbed her. "Why are you bleeding?" he gasped. His mate. Bleeding, before him. He couldn't focus on her. Clutched at her. Needed to know. "SHH, just another few minutes, Nick, and you can, mark me." His rapid breathing was just bringing the scent of blood to him so strongly. "I want to," he whispered. Goddess, he did want to mark her, and she was finally going to let him. Felt her move into his arms. His eyes were so heavy he couldn't keep them open to see her. Was she all right? So much blood. The scent was so strong, baby. He was really struggling to hold on to his senses now. It felt really weird, like time was slowing down around him. She needed help. He couldn't help her. He felt himself falling down to the floor, his whole body heavy. "Jeremy," he gasped, opening a link to his beta, a last-ditch effort to get help for his bleeding mate. Couldn't, Lucinda, didn't, his thoughts becoming erratic and jumbled in his mind. "Boss," he heard Jeremy, sounded kind of distorted like he was far away. "Lucinda, blood, I can't." The link was gone. He couldn't focus on it to maintain it, to keep it open. Rip was roaring in his mind, clawing at everything, felt so far away from him now. Nick could hear his wolf snarling and growling, throwing a fit like nothing Nick had ever felt before, felt like his wolf was being dragged away from him and he was trying to fight his way back. So far back into the darkness he was going. Then just gone. His mind was quiet. He could feel a body moving against him, breathed in, smell her, his mate, it was her blood scent, she was grinding on him now, a mouth on his, kissing him. It smelled like her, but also felt so wrong, felt a hand wrap around his CK and start moving back and forth, heard a soft moan in his ear. "Mark me, Nick." "Wait," he gasped, trying to move any part of him. Couldn't even lift an arm, knew it was wrong, but could only smell her. "No, smell me, Nick, I'm right here. I want you." He couldn't move, everything was wrong. He felt her neck against his mouth, tasted her blood on his lips. "One bite, Nick, that's all it will take, and I'll be yours forever." Goddess, he did want to mark her. His mouth moved on her neck, kissing her. But why? Sucked deeply on her neck, her blood on his tongue. Why so much blood? Injured, popped into his mind. Anxiety suddenly filled him. She was injured. Had he done that? Her blood, his mouth. Her blood, he could taste it, smell it. All consuming him. "Please, Nick, I'll mark you right back, I want you." Her body was pressed on his. He could feel it sliding against him, unable to do anything or think any more. He wanted his mate, Lucinda. He moaned and felt his fangs start to protrude. Yes, he would mark her now. Then she was suddenly gone, he couldn't even move to get her back. "Where?" he groaned, heard some sort of commotion, but couldn't even open his eyes or turn his head to see who or what it was. "Open your eyes, Nick," was yelled at him. It felt weird and fuzzy, like someone was yelling through a bubble or something. Somehow, he managed to open his eyes, but could not focus. There was way too much light pouring into his sight, so bright, so pretty. There were funny bubbles all around him with distorted images of someone in them, a man's weird-looking shaped head. He knew that man, Jeremy. All the bubbles popped in front of him, he blinked and stared at the man, Lucinda. "It's not her." Then his whole body was rocking and shaking. Earthquake, popped into his mind. "Smell blood," he said and registered the scent. He knew that scent, Lucinda. "It is, Nick. Wake up." His eyes moved. Wow, the bubbles were back and that funny-looking man too. Beta popped into his head. He couldn't move, could barely focus on anything. Too many bubbles around him, bright and shiny like the sun, felt pain shoot through the side of his head and then nothing. Darkness was all around him, it was really weird. The light seemed to take forever to go, till it was a tiny pinpoint in the distance. Then poof, snuffed out. The rest of the audiobook will be continued in the next episode. Join us on Patreon for early access or more great audiobooks, a link is provided in the video description.